Hey folks, I'm Matt from Cut Content, and thank you for tuning in to DM Radio. So today we're going to talk about non-player characters, because as a DM, that's actually the vast majority of what you'll be doing. No matter what planning you're going through for each session, whatever maps you're making, or monsters you're getting ready, like 90% of the job is role-playing various NPCs. And so the question isn't so much how to do that, it's how to make that interesting for the players and, of course, for yourself. So let's start off real simple. How do you get the idea for an NPC? I personally have a couple of ways of doing it. One, if you recognize a need like, oh, well, in this campaign I'm going to have the king in disguise. Don't take that. I did that. It's mine. But I guess that might not be the first time that trope's ever been used, so yeah, let's say you do that. Then you're like, well, obviously, I need to make up the king. So there. First one, real simple, you're just filling in the needs of the plot. But most of the NPCs that players encounter are not plot critical. It's just how it works. Most people in the world don't have some magical importance to the specific quest that you are on. So how do you get some of these other interesting characters? Or what if even you need a king, but you have no idea what to do with that? You're not sure what race or class to make him, or anything like that? Well, there are a few options. One is, of course, standard brainstorming, but the other ones, outside of just, thinking really hard about it and fulfilling a need that you have, is look through artwork. It's one of the ones I do most often. There are 1,000 talented artists out there who draw fantasy, science fiction, weird steampunk post-apocalyptic stuff, whatever you're looking for. And a lot of it can be really inspirational. I have seen pictures and been like, oh, I can design a campaign around this entire thing, because it just is that spark of inspiration in you. Which I personally find to be really helpful. So I've got a huge file of pretty much every piece of fantasy and science fiction artwork I've ever enjoyed, and I've just all saved into one big, well, not one big, I've got denominations, but it's all under one heading, which is DM images, and I'll just browse through them. It's real simple. Once they're all in one place, you just click through, and something will catch your eye. Something always does. And the other way that I recommend, honestly, doing, even if it's not for a campaign, just as practice, is the 5th edition DM's Guide contains a lot of guidelines for making NPCs. And the best thing about that is there are a ton of random tables. And so one thing that can be really helpful is to just, I will roll on this table, I will stick with whatever roll I get, it will determine their, what they're good at, what they're bad at, their personality, their flaw, their goals, their motivations. And you have to find a way to tie it all together and make a cohesive character. And that's a great, almost improvisational exercise for creating people who seem real, because real people aren't inorganic. They're not molded. Things happen throughout the course of an individual's life that add up in unexpected ways. So leaning into that randomness can be really helpful. And, of course, when you're actually doing that for a game, sometimes you're like, oh, well, I had this whole idea for what this character would be based on my first 6 rolls, but the 7th one sort of clashes with them. But on this 7th table, there's another option. Just swap that one around, make it work even better with the character. That's the best part about random tables, is that they're as random as you want them to be. Don't tell anybody that, though. It's like a well-guarded industry secret. But that's a really good way to get some ideas, is through, brainstorming and artwork and just the luck of the draw. So once you have these ideas, what do you do with them? So obviously you have to figure out what race they are, and if they're going to be, well, even if they're not going to be in combat, honestly, I like to have an idea of what class my NPCs would be. Now, most of the time, it's probably going to be like commoner, because that's an NPC class, but for my real important NPCs, I'm like, no, these are special people, and I often make actual character sheets for them, so that they can feel more on par with a sort of a scaling power level that the players understand. So I would highly recommend that. But even that is mostly cosmetic. What is it actually that makes a person who they are? And that is a huge philosophical question which you only kind of have to grapple with. So, one thing to pay attention to is that all conflict, and really all good gaming, as well as all good writing or television or theater, is motivated by people having goals. And when those goals come into conflict, things get really interesting. But you'll never do a scene in a play and not think, what does my character want? You should always be thinking, what does this person want? And what are they willing to do to get it? So, we're going to make up an NPC right now just for the example purposes of this video. So, there'll be a Dragonborn, because why not? And there'll be a Dragonborn cleric. How about? There we go. So we just have a random race class combination. And what does this Dragonborn cleric want? Say it's a cleric of, well, for using standard D&D gods, Bahamut. Lawful good, dragon god, all makes sense. So, maybe what is really important to this particular Dragonborn is that they want to prove to other Dragonborn that just because they were not born with gold scales, that they are equivalent in importance and in their devotion to Bahamut. Bahamut's technically the Platinum Dragon, but, you know, that's right now, this whole scales thing, that's not really canon Dragonborn, not to my knowledge. I don't think they've got a caste system, but maybe you came up with one. I mean, that is a fairly good analog to real-life racism, and it makes that character seem much more identifiable, albeit, if you'll pardon the pun, a little too black and white. But that's a fairly simple, straightforward goal, you know, to prove that I can be as good as anybody else regardless of the circumstances of my birth. Standard fantasy thing. But it can still be a meaningful goal and provide a lot of interesting interaction. So, what are they willing to do to achieve those goals? And most often the question you're really asking is, how unnaturally are they willing to act to get what they want? Because it's easy for a lawful good cleric to follow lawful good means in order to do what he believes is right. In fact, that could be the flaw. Maybe this cleric is positive that the right way to gain the recognition he deserves is by following the law to the letter. You know, I will show them through my actions that I am good enough. But that might not get him what he wants. And at what point does he have to consider different options? When is violence appropriate? When are underhanded means for a lofty goal something that's acceptable? What about when you hit a moral gray area? So, say there's a gold dragon who has always oppressed you, a gold dragonborn, and they come in, they want healing. Is his vendetta against sort of this caste system personal or not? Is it an easy thing to say that, you know, I will heal you even though I don't like you, or is it a level of, I will heal you if you do something for me? You know, all sorts of different ways that just this one situation of class conflict can create a really intriguing dynamic. Because, for example, what if that Dragonborn who needs healing is a member of the party? Suddenly you've got a whole, basically, subquest based around the cleric you have access to, who you think might even be a good person, is still an obstacle. And that also makes the PCs question, how are they going to deal with it? Are they going to do what this person wants? Are they going to threaten this person? Are they going to attempt to negotiate? There are a ton of ways around it, but it's something that the players will have to actively think about. Furthermore, will it matter who this Dragonborn is around? Say this cleric is, you know, there's a high priest of Bahamut standing right behind him. Cleric's more likely than not gonna heal the party member. But say that he leans in afterwards and whispers, you know, if you come in and it's just you and me, we're gonna have a problem. Or even if you make it clear based on his facial expression that he's not pleased about having to do this. And if he's really not subtle, he might even protest to this high priest, thus alerting the PCs that there might be a source of conflict there. But all that goes to show that characters interact differently around other characters. I don't act the same way around every single person. I do my best to, you've got a baseline in your personality, but you act different around your parents than you do around your high school friends, for example. You act differently around your college professors than you do around somebody who's interviewing you for a job. People are fluid, and that can be complicated, but it also makes them feel honest. So, if you're having your characters act and react differently when they're in different presences, what happens when there's a conflict? How does that character react when challenged? And this can be as simple as fight or flight. Say this Dragonborn priest prefers to fight. He will not back down. But that's often a bit too simple. So let's say he won't back down in reality, but he is willing to back down maybe in a conversation. But he's like, this lawful good cleric is maybe willing to work with less than savory individuals and have them do less than savory things in order to achieve what he wants. So this party member needs healing, and he says, you'll have to do this for me if I'm going to heal you, or you will have to, why would I do this because I hate you, or whatever. The party finds a way, they're confronted, there are 4 of us and 1 of you, and nobody else is around. We're going to murder you if you don't heal our dude. Party morality aside, say that happens. The cleric could be, you could say, no, I'm calling your bluff. And that's a perfectly valid thing for him to do, but he could also say, whoa, that's too much, you're right, I'm sorry, let's lay on hands, he's healed. Not lay on hands, I don't think clerics do that, but point being, after actually healing the party member, he could have people go after the party, or say, make sure that these people never approach me again, by any means necessary, even. As long as I don't have to hear about it. That could be how he still justifies his lawful goodness to himself. Very few NPCs are evil for the sake of being evil. In fact, a much better way of looking at NPCs in terms of how they feel about what they're doing isn't even, their goal specifically, because the Dragonborn may have this goal of, I am going to affect social change, and he may be willing to use just pretty terrible things, maybe even as far as assassination, in order to do that. But he justifies it to himself. And a lot of that can be sort of worked with by identifying what does the character like and dislike about themselves. Maybe if somebody challenges his integrity on a small issue, because this cleric knows that he has done things that he should not be doing, he will stand very firm over these minor things, even when they seem like a not big deal to pretty much anybody else. On the other hand, maybe he's proud that he's willing to sacrifice his own personal spiritual beliefs and well-being for the advancement of all, even if he ends up being sort of inwardly selfish, and the advancement of all just means his own advancement, which he's not acknowledging. But you see what I'm saying? These are layered characters. This one Dragonborn who we've created in the past 10 minutes is already easily a minor NPC you could have, or even a potential, not I don't think he's quite, big bad evil guy, but maybe a mini-boss, sort of somebody who is being manipulated, or genuinely believes that he's doing what he has to, but all the same is an obstacle to the party. And this is a lawful good character who could still end up being a villain, even if the party is also made up of good aligned characters. Now, speaking of villains, too often, they are when we let ourselves go. It's when we decide, this is a villain, this is an enemy, they don't have to have meaningful motivation or Really, what does it matter what they like about themselves? They're villains. We're gonna fight them, we're gonna kill them. But hate this guy because, trust me, he is horrid is not really a compelling argument. It's much more interesting to either genuinely make the players dislike this character, or dislike this character on principle because of something they've done to an NPC the characters like, or have the NPC villain be really nice, or charming, or pretty much anything that can make it harder for the party to confront him. Not just in terms of, wow, this guy's a really high challenge rating, maybe we shouldn't do this. They could be like, hey, your methods may be evil, but your ends are just. But because your methods are evil, we have to, actually, you've got some really good points. And then suddenly there's this black and white, no, the ends don't justify the means argument that gets complicated. And that's by far one of the most interesting things that can happen in D&D. I ran a campaign my first year of college where there were basically two major political factions, and the party kept betraying either side because as soon as they talked to the other one, they'd be like, no, you're right, you make some really good points. And eventually it led to the party getting split, and ultimately I ended up running two campaigns simultaneously, which was a terrible idea. But that aside, it was a really great example of the party was willing to act based on how they felt about these NPCs. And you are all the NPCs, but don't make the party feel that way. And what I mean by that is, sometimes we have tendencies with NPCs that we oftentimes have in real life that sort of always manifest, regardless of whatever the character is. So, I, for example, have a hard time. I like to have characters who subvert expectations by being straightforward. For whatever reason, parties, it's kind of the last thing they expect. They're like, alright, how are we going to get this information out? And turns out, you just ask, half the time the person's going to say yes. But that's also not entirely interesting. So, for example, one time I realized I was relying far too heavily on that. So, they were conducting a murder investigation, and there was this one person who was really shady, wouldn't open his house to them, wouldn't let them come in, anything. He was just agoraphobic. Like, he had nothing to do with the murder, he was just scared, and sort of the air of, oh god, people are being killed, was compounding upon his already messed up personality stuff. And that turned out to be a really interesting moment. They're like, because they sort of moved on, solved the crime, and then they're like, wait, what about that guy? I'm like, what about that guy? He's got some problems. Most people do. And that's one thing to think about, is that everybody has their own story and their own struggles. Even the most simple farmer NPC may have had a bad harvest, or even lost a child not too long before. People react differently in different situations, but those situations also have to take into account the various stressors they may be experiencing. Inversely, stuff may be going great, and that may make them more likely to be pleasant or helpful. Or not so much. You see, on the one hand, you've done a bunch of services for this king who is in disguise, and he feels really good, and he's like, excellent, now we can fight evil all that much better. Or maybe things are going really well for you, and therefore the villain is having a problem. And the villain's got there are a couple villains even, who all are like working together like some sort of cabal, and things are going well for you. That may make them more likely to share information with each other. It's always important to remember that even villains have friends. I ran a campaign recently where basically the whole first 4 months of the campaign, everything the party did ended up being at the whim of these 3 individuals who previously shared power with 5 other people. And the party killed all those 5 other people and like, we're nailing it! And then they found out as they killed the last one, no, it turns out those 3 people actually like each other. They wanted all of us gone, and so that they could just divide the power much more evenly, and they're sticking to that. And suddenly the PCs had to realize, like, oh, we're not going to be able to divide and conquer anymore because we didn't do most of the dividing, they did, and these three villains are friends. They're just straight up friends. It's one of the most important examples of NPCs are people too. And you always have to just own that. People aren't always logical. People generally have a personality. That personality may manifest itself in different ways in different situations. Now, some things you can do to make characters seem more consistent is if you give one of them a specific turn of phrase. Like if you've ever read the Dresden Files, Harry Dresden says the phrase "hell's bells" all the time, which is something that, nobody really says, but it's a nice identifying mark of his character. Or even maybe the way that the character speaks has a particular cadence. Maybe their verb placement is a little weird. Like, you can go into all sorts of linguistic stuff or physical tics, but it all sort of goes under this one big heading of role-playing NPCs. And I can tell you all day that there are, like, little tricks to make them feel more real. Be okay with them pausing. Have them have specific phrases they use more than others. What are their lines in the sand? All that sort of thing. But what it's really going to come down to is that you can't, as a DM, be ashamed to play it up. The more you act, the more you feel what these NPCs are feeling, the more you express that to the party, the bigger a deal it's going to be. We can have a whole episode, and in fact, at some point, we probably will have a whole episode that's just talking about getting everybody actively involved in the role-playing of the game. But at the end of the day, it's all going to start with you. And if you're actually role-playing, putting yourself in the shoes of these characters, speaking in character, show, don't tell, is the way it's always described, and that's really good advice. Then suddenly this dragonborn cleric who's unwilling to heal this party member isn't just you saying the cleric is unwilling to help. Suddenly you're looking at this party member and going, after everything your kind have done to me, do you really think that I would assist you now? No. No, I value myself more than that. And it may feel silly at first, but that honest moment creates, one, an impetus for the players to engage in a role-playing sense, and two, that statement about valuing himself, that is going to make some players, at least attentive ones, be like, wait, hold on, there's a whole story here that we're not experiencing. And they don't have to experience it. But even if they don't, in fact, sometimes more so if they don't, it adds to the feeling of the world being a living, breathing place on which they can have an impact. And sometimes, NPCs they care about die. Or are just hurt emotionally. And that can really change the whole tenor of the campaign. And it can give your players a motivation. Because so much of what we do in life isn't motivated by logic or, I want money, therefore this. Or, well, I am good, therefore I will do this good thing. It's motivated by how we feel about the people around us. And since you're everybody around those players, a lot of that falls to you. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll have more DM Radio next week and some content up this weekend. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you again soon.